Shazam movie review. I'm gonna start here by kind of talking about the character. So if you're only interested in hearing my opinion about the movie, then this is probably going to be a bit boring for you. You can skip this video if you want. But yeah, Captain Marvel, the character, I've long been kind of fascinated by him. So I'll go through my history briefly. I picked up as a kind of young kid, or like around 12 or 13 or something. I forget exactly how, but I picked up through various references that this was some sort of old famous golden age superhero. Like the name would pop up in kind of old books or old movies or something like that. The clearest example I can think of right now is West Side Story, right? Which was a old movie from like 1961 or something, where one of the Jets, Baby John, is reading a comic, and he says, Captain Marvel, gee, I love him. And there's a couple lines of dialogue about Captain Marvel. So like I knew that Captain Marvel was like some sort of like famous golden age superhero character. But like it was very hard to kind of get information on him, and especially those of you who are older will remember this, but kind of before Wikipedia, before the internet really kind of came into its full form, back in the 80s and early 90s, there were all these things where it was hard to get information on them. Like pop culture stuff. Like if you wanted to find information on like a famous historical battle, that was in the library somehow. But if you wanted to find information on Captain Marvel, where do you find it at, right? So it was just kind of a big question mark. I was collecting comics around about, the early 90s. So I bought a lot of comics that were popular in the early 90s, like 92, 93. Sorry, I say comics. Actually, I was exclusively a DC man at the time. Largely just because those were the characters I was more familiar with. And I figured I only had kind of enough money to kind of invest in one comic book company. So right, I was buying a lot of DC comics in the early 90s, and also in the comic book stores that I would frequent, in like the bargain bin, they would have a lot of old comic books that were beat up a little bit, that you could buy for really cheap, and those were mostly from the 1980s. So the comics in my collection were from the 1980s and the early 90s, which was a period when DC Comics really didn't know what to do with Captain Marvel. I don't know, maybe he got his own series at some point during that period and I missed it, but he would, in the comics I had at least, he would not pop up a lot. So when he did pop up, every now and again he would appear, and I would be like, Captain Marvel. I'm like, he's really famous for some reason, but I don't know why, and he was like this old school superhero. I was fascinated back in those days by kind of the history of a lot of these superheroes, and how some of them had this kind of long history. Anyways, then the internet came around and Wikipedia, and kind of at one point, kind of around 2006, I was, kind of going through and looking at all this random stuff up on Wikipedia. And I looked up Captain Marvel, and sure enough, there was his whole history. If you're not familiar with this, it's a fascinating history, and there's a lot of videos on YouTube already kind of going through this history, doing a lot better job than I am, kind of more professionally done and stuff like that. And I think especially since this movie came out, a lot more people have been making videos about this, but I'll just try and give my own brief kind of version of it. So Captain Marvel, it turns out, if you go onto Wikipedia or whatever, was created by Fawcett Comics, which at the time was not DC Comics. It was one of DC Comic Books' competitors. And it was kind of like their version of Superman, or they were kind of ripping off Superman, essentially. But what's interesting about Captain Marvel is he outsold Superman throughout the 1940s. In fact, I think if I'm remembering right, he was like the most popular superhero, hands down, throughout the 1940s. Which is interesting because, you know, like I said, when I was growing up, you really didn't hear much at all about him. Like I knew he was a superhero and he would pop up occasionally, but yeah, I mean, nobody talked about him really in the early 90s. But yeah, the most popular superhero ever in the 1940s. Yeah, interesting how some of this stuff gets forgotten, huh? And then DC Comics sued Fawcett Comics and said, look, this Captain Marvel character is just a ripoff of our Superman. And it was in the courts for a few years, but eventually the judge sided with DC Comics, and Captain Marvel had to stop publication. Now, in the 60s, Marvel Comics, which wasn't around during the 1940s, or they had a different name during the 1940s, they were Timely Comics, which was a precursor to Marvel Comics. Anyways, somebody at Marvel said, oh, hey, the rights to Captain Marvel aren't being used anymore. And our company name is Marvel, so we should totally create a superhero named Captain Marvel because that's our company. And so they did, and they trademarked the name, which is kind of the reason that nobody can call this character Captain Marvel anymore. That's why they call the character Shazam in the movie. Or sorry, that's why they call the movie Shazam, and they don't name the character. Meanwhile, Fawcett Comics went bankrupt, and DC bought the rights to it in the 1970s. And throughout this was back when DC had the multiverse concept, which was all these different superheroes are living in different universes. And so Captain Marvel and all his characters were living in a separate universe. But then in the Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1986, they kind of merged all these universes together. And then Captain Marvel was in the same universe as all the rest of the DC characters. Once I found all this out, I thought the character was even more fascinating. I don't know why. A bit of my personality or whatever. I've always found these kind of things fascinating. The kind of convoluted history of the character. But I also just thought it was kind of weird that, I mean, Captain Marvel was essentially created as a Superman clone. Now DC had the rights to him, so now he was in the DC universe, but DC already has a Superman, right? So what are they going to do with Captain Marvel? And I think that was the reason kind of throughout the 80s and 90s that he wasn't really featured that prominently in DC Comics. But the other thing I've always kind of found a bit fascinating is kind of the evolution of comic books and how you have all these kind of characters who were designed for kids, like young children in the 1940s and 50s. As comic book audiences evolved to be kind of older people, like older meaning, you know, like 20s and 30s, the comics got a lot more darker and more violent and stuff like that. But you still have these very kind of kiddie-type characters because of the original source material. And Captain Marvel and the Marvel family is like Exhibit A in like this weird kind of concept because it's like so cartoony and so kiddie. I mean, there's Captain Marvel, but there's also like the whole Marvel family, Mary Marvel, Captain Marvel Jr., the Talkie Tawny, this talking tiger who hangs out with the Marvel family. And here they were kind of being integrated into these more mature comic book storylines throughout the 90s and 2000s and stuff like that. And I always thought that was quite interesting, the way DC would try and reimagine these characters where it's kind of more mature storyline. So these kind of things just kind of have always fascinated me. And that's one of the reasons why this character has long been a source of fascination for me. None of that has anything to do with the movie. It's just something I thought was interesting. Well, it has something to do with the movie a little bit. It colors my perception of it. It explains that I was kind of already predisposed to be interested in this. Oh, by the way, I guess while I'm talking about the whole controversy with the name, because Marvel Comics had trademarked the name Captain Marvel, what DC Comics has always done is any comic book featuring Captain Marvel, the comic book is named Shazam. But then the character itself can still be called Captain Marvel just as long as it's not in the title. What they did in this movie is they followed the tradition. The movie is named Shazam. But then they never mention Captain Marvel's name anywhere in the movie. Although they do kind of make a running joke out of it. He can't pick a name and they're calling him Captain Sparkle or Captain Thunderclap or something like that. I was reading an interview somewhere where apparently there was no legal reason why they couldn't call him Captain Marvel. People think, although it's a little bit murky because nobody's actually put this to the test. I mean, maybe Marvel Comics would have objected, but they think they could have gotten away with it. But because, this is a big Hollywood production and loads of money behind it and stuff like that, they're really worried about brand confusion. So, like on the DC side as well, they don't want to call him Captain Marvel because it's going to be a brand confusion and confuse their audience possibly. Unless their audiences are people like me who've wasted all their youth kind of reading up on this stuff. Okay, anyways, on to the movie. Yeah, I liked it. This was, incidentally, the first DC Universe movie I've seen. And why, huh? Like I said, when I was younger, I only collected DC Comics. I didn't collect the Marvel Comics. But those Marvel movies have consistently been getting good reviews. And those DC movies have not been. So I've just kept seeing the Marvel movies and just have never gotten around to seeing the DC Universe movies. I never really planned not to see it. It was just something that happened. So this movie is mostly standalone, there are enough references. There are more than enough references to make it clear that this is in the same universe as the Batman and the Superman movies and the Justice League. Which, I mean, on the one hand, it kind of links the movie to the DC universe, which has not been doing that great. So, mixed feelings about that maybe. Although, I've never seen any of those movies. I just know about it secondhand. But on the other hand, I said what's kind of always made Captain Marvel a bit funny or interesting, at least since 1986, is he's a Superman clone who's in the same universe as Superman, which makes him completely redundant, but it also makes him kind of interesting for that same reason. Like, what are they going to do with this character to make him different from Superman? So, in that respect, it's kind of cool that he's in the same universe as Superman. This movie, I've seen a few other critics who have said this is like a throwback to the movies from the 1990s, where things could be a little bit darker. And there are some darker scenes in this. I mentioned I saw other critics who pointed that out, because I'm not sure I would have made that connection on my own. I mean, I lived through the 90s, obviously. But somehow it just kind of escaped my notice that movies had gotten sanitized over the years. I mean, when I hear somebody else say it, it makes perfect sense. I am kind of like, oh yeah, I guess movies back in the 90s were maybe different. I somehow never noticed they changed. But anyways, when somebody else had pointed it out to me, it did make sense. This movie, in addition to having some dark scenes, of course, is more more notable for having a lot of funny scenes. I'm going to be honest, I don't think all the comedy in this movie was really working, especially at the beginning. What was his name? The Freddy character. I forget his name. Freddie Freeman. The character with the crutches was making a lot of jokes and they weren't really funny. And Billy Batson's character was doing some bantering, and none of it was really funny to me. Like, I understand these were supposed to be the laugh beats, but I was just thinking, this movie is not as funny as it thinks it is. But then, once Billy Batson gets transformed into Captain Marvel, the guy they have playing him, what was his name? Zachary Levi or something? He is just brilliant. And I think it's a bit of a different interpretation than the Captain Marvel from the comic books. But, fair enough. It's a different medium, so we're seeing some different interpretations on the character. The way his mannerisms and stuff like that. Sorry, I'm gonna have to take this into the shower. This is what happens now when the baby cries. I have to finish the video in the shower. Yeah, the guy who's playing the adult version of Captain Marvel, the superhero one, he is just perfect for that role. So he really kind of sold all the comedy for me, and all his kind of mugging for the camera and just kind of all his one-liners and stuff like that. Those parts I was laughing at. I thought I'm not sure if the writing got better at that point, or I think he was just kind of I don't want to say he was a more talented actor, but he was definitely 100% suited to that role. Right, then, I'm going to spoil something major here, so fair warning. Every other review I've seen of this movie has taken care not to spoil this point. Because none of the trailers spoiled it. The movie studio did a really good job of not spoiling it. So people have been respecting that. But I really want to talk about this. And odds are, by the time you see this video, whoever you are, this movie will have already been out for quite some time. Just because views on this channel tend to accumulate very slowly over time. So, maybe you're watching this 5 years in the future, and this movie's an old movie at this point, has already been spoiled long ago. Anyways, at this point in time, at the time I'm recording this, where the movie is still in studios, where the movie is still in theaters, none of the major studios or trailers or publications have spoiled this. But I will. At the end of the movie, the Marvel family comes, which I was really pleasantly surprised by. Because, of course, being a comic book geek, I was recognizing this. I was like, all right, there's a character named Mary. Okay, I thought she's going to be Mary Marvel. And then, of course, there was a Freddy character who had the crutches, and I was like, okay, he's going to be Captain Marvel Jr. But I was thinking that this would be something that they would pay off maybe in a sequel someday, or they were just kind of throwing out Easter eggs for the fans by having a character named Mary or something like that. I didn't really think they would bring the whole Marvel family in the same movie. But then sure enough, yeah, at the end of the movie, at the ending scene in the movie, we got the whole Marvel family. So there was Captain Marvel and Mary Marvel and Captain Marvel Jr., who's the Freddy character. And all of these were from the comic books. Now the other kids also turned into superheroes, Marvel families. And these are not from the comic books as far as I'm aware, although I haven't kept up with comic books in recent years. So unless it's a recent thing, But I mean, it's definitely not from the old school Captain Marvel. The old school Captain Marvel family was Mary Marvel, Captain Marvel Jr., and then Captain Marvel, and some other funny characters like Uncle Dudley and stuff like that. But actually, speaking of a lot of other funny characters, there were a lot of other funny characters who also got Marvel powers. Like, there were like the 3 Marvel Lieutenants, and then I think there was a Marvel Bunny and stuff like that. So even though these other kids weren't in the comics, the kind of general concept of having kind of a very large family of people who have these Captain Marvel powers does kind of come from the original comics. Yeah, and I was just really happy because you see this family, these kids, and they gradually kind of become a bigger and bigger part of the movie, and they were all great. I mean, that little girl was real cute. Mary Marvel character was great. I forget the names. The guy was always Eugene, who was always playing the video games. I mean, they didn't get a lot of screen time or whatever, but they were great. And then they showed up to help fight the villain, and I thought, oh, okay, well, this is interesting, but sure, it's got like kind of that Goonies vibe where there's a group of kind of kids trying to take on the bad guy, and then they all get their superpowers, and I thought, yes. I mean, what a great way to bring kind of the corny, lovable corniness from the original Captain Marvel comics into the movies. I did not think they were going to do that, but was very pleasantly surprised. And then the other thing to spoil, well, actually, do I want to talk about this more? Yeah. That ending scene was quite good. I would have liked to see even more of the Captain Marvel family, but I guess what we saw of them was enough. I also was expecting like a bigger payoff between Captain Marvel Jr. and those bullies. I thought that was paid off a little bit. I mean, they did pay it off, but it was just kind of like they got kind of wedgies, and they were yelling out, "Oh, he's giving us a suitcase wedgie," but it was mostly off screen. I was thinking there would be kind of a more, that confrontation that had been being built up throughout the movie would have taken more of a center stage. Yeah, and then at the end of the movie there's a cameo from Superman, only you never see the actor's face, which is perhaps a sign that the DC universe is beginning to unravel here, like they couldn't get Henry Cavill to fulfill his, well, no, he wouldn't have been under contract, but Henry Cavill was obviously not interested in doing that cameo. So, I mean, I hate to say it, but if this had been a Marvel Studios movie, they totally would have arranged all those cameos and people would totally have done it. I mean, Marvel would not have needed to shoot the character from the neck down because they couldn't get the actor to show up. Marvel is much better at integrating their universe. But whatever. It's still cool that Superman and Captain Marvel are officially in the same universe here. Other things to talk about. It was an enjoyable movie. It definitely had its moments. It was definitely cheesy at points as well. And kind of like, I was just thinking of this because I was just talking about those bullies. That scene at the beginning when those bullies are beating up like the Freddy character, I thought, oh, this is just so cliche. Like the script needs a beat here where some bully characters who are going to cause drama or tension or give Billy Batson a chance to show bravery. But it was just. It was over the top. I mean, here they come speeding with a car, they hit the crippled kid, and then they start, sorry, I shouldn't say crippled, should I? That's totally not PC anymore these days. My excuse is, I think in the comic books they often refer to that character as crippled. So I think that's why it's in my mind. I think in the movie he even makes a joking reference to himself as being crippled. Or anyways, they hit the kid with the crutches, and then they start kicking him. And the whole schoolyard is watching, and I was thinking, you know, like, I understand school bullies are a real thing, but this is a little bit over the top. Yeah, and then when Billy Batson kind of hits them, and he's like, oh, sorry, that was a low move, but I guess you guys don't play fair anyways, do you? And I thought, oh, this movie is not as funny as it thinks it is. That was just kind of one of those one-liners that fell flat to me. Or I think there was a lot of this in the beginning of the movie, where there's these kind of one-liners and attempts at comedies that just were not all that funny, really. But again, to repeat what I said earlier, once the character changed into Captain Marvel and they got that Zachary Levi character and actor, or whatever his name is, to play it, he really sold it. And all the scenes with him were really funny, like that scene with the bus, right? Where he pulls out the mattress and is just pointing at the mattress, and yeah, I mean, really all the scenes with him, he completely sold it. And a nice little character arc here, because I mean, like, not only did he sell like kind of the comedy and the kind of general mugging and stuff like that, like mugging for the camera, but you know, when the real bad guy shows up, you completely get the sense that this is a kid in an adult's body who does not know how to fight a supervillain and is just kind of way out of his league. I mean, that was just sold so well by the actors there, which of course set it up nicely for the character arc of how he does actually kind of learn to fight back and stuff like that. So there's a nice little character arc there. I don't know if this is worth complaining about. I mean, at no point does this character ever get any sort of combat training or anything like that. So I understand near the end of the movie he got his courage back, but like, how in order to get into the fist fight with Dr. Savannah, I mean, where does that come from? But it's pointless to complain about these in movies, because kind of every superhero origin story, almost everyone, they just show how the character gets his powers. They never show how the character learns how to actually fight or pull off any fight moves. The arguable exception would be Batman, or kind of characters without any superpowers. I mean, Batman goes through a training montage, but all these other characters just get their superpowers, and then they just somehow learning how to fight comes with that. Yeah, what else did I want to say? Oh, speaking of character arcs, I mean, not only does he learn how to get his courage up to confront the bad guy, but that whole kind of character arc where at first he gets the powers and he's acting like a really selfish and doesn't know what to do with them, and then he learns responsibility at the end. I mean, it's cliche, but you know, we are living in a day and age where there are a lot of kind of Hollywood movies which are just explosions with no character arcs. So the fact that this movie had some kind of definitive character arcs, you can appreciate, even if there are some plot holes in here, and yeah, even if some of the jokes don't really land all that well. Yeah, speaking of plot holes, I have this feeling when I was watching this movie that there were some other kind of plot holes that I was picking up on, but I can't remember what they are now. At any rate, it obviously didn't spoil the movie for me. So final verdict, some flaws in this movie, but in spite of everything, I really enjoyed it. And I've always found this kind of character fascinating anyways. So yeah. I would say I'd recommend it, but I've spoiled everything in this video, haven't I? So hopefully by the time you're watching this video, you've already seen the movie. But yeah, if you haven't, I would recommend it anyways.